in an organization, if you are providing identity, okay, so identity and access there has to be a cycle. Because why? Because identities, they move with time. You might have increased access, decreased access, you might leave an organization. There's a life cycle involved with every identity which has access, right? And that is the provisioning life cycle. So what happens is, whenever you go into an organization, first thing that happens in an organization is your identity proofing takes place, right? You are hired, you have a job description, you are hired, and then you are first onboarded. And before onboarding, your identity data is taken, your identity is created inside an organization's system and database, and then you are given some kind of either a physical form of identity or a logical form of identity. This process is called provisioning and onboarding. Now, once you do provisioning and onboarding, generally you sign a acceptable use certificate, acceptable use policy. You say that fine, you are giving me access to your resources. I'm going to use these resources in a due care and due diligent manner. Okay, and that's called signing the AUP. And generally, then you are told about the security best practices. You have an onboarding period, and then most of the organizations today configure MFA on all the applications which you access. Okay, this is the part of the provisioning and onboarding cycle. And then when users leave the organization, or they are shifted to some other organization, or they sidestep somewhere, you need to deprovision them. You need to deprovision the access, and you need to remove the identity. And that is also very critical, that the user is removed from your access provisioning system. Now, this becomes very critical, that at what point you should remove the identity and access of a particular subject. Because if you do it prematurely, then it might be a human factor that the person comes to know that he's been fired, which most of the organizations in the West do. In India, it does not happen like that. Right? In India, they are more human. They call you office, and they will say, okay, you are fired. We don't have the funds, or we don't have the project. You're on bench. You're kept on bench for 3 months, 6 months. It doesn't happen. This doesn't happen in West. In West, you are one fine day, you get up and you are not there in the system. Either an email comes to your personal account or your official account, and the moment you read that email, access is removed, right? So you have to be very, very either humane also, or you have to also keep in mind that human beings are, the weakest link. So if your access remains, then there might be a threat of, users doing something harmful to the organization's assets. So it has to be timed in such a manner that the access is revoked once an individual's interview is going, just during or immediately after the interview, so that the person is at peace. Okay. Hardware should always be taken back from the users, and they should always be reminded of the non-disclosure agreement that you are under NDA of the organization. So this is the access provisioning life cycle. Okay, whenever you have your roles might change. You join as an analyst, you become a junior analyst, then a senior analyst, then you become a lead, then you become a team lead, then you become a manager, then you become a senior manager. With time, your access levels increase. Okay, but that's why audit is required, so that you are not carrying all your access levels as you move up the chain, right? Your access levels have to be revoked as and when you change your roles. Okay, so once the role changes, access should be as per that role, and you may not require lower level access, and that has to be revoked. So whenever roles change, access levels change. And then finally, you need to keep on, as a security professional, you need to see that account maintenance and review of access is done regularly, so that what does not take place, privilege creep. Okay. Slowly, people are accumulating more privileges, and this should not happen. And that's why you need to carry out audit. Right. Then finally, access has to be monitored and controlled. You have to continuously monitor, so that your access is as per what is the defined policy of the organization, and it is controlled, because access is one of the major critical factor which can decide the security of an organization. If you over provision something, bad. You under provision something, efficiency is lost. So that's why you need to always control and review access at all times. Okay. Now, once you look at access, the access is also about, one major thing that comes from access is just a second. That once you look at access, it is some permissions with the subject, what permission, the subject has on the object. What are the rights? Rights are generally what changes can it make? Okay. Can it modify the object? And privileges are combination of both permissions and rights. What is my level that I can do to the level which I can access a particular subject? And then what are my rights on that subject? These two, when they combine, it becomes a privilege for a subject. Now, generally, we saw identity, we saw authentication, and now we saw the rights, privileges, and permissions, right? This is what is authorization. What are you authorized to do on the object, right? Now, authorization can be, can be in many ways, okay? First is, you say implicit denial. Once you have, created identity and given him, he has given authentication. Once the first enrollment has taken, you give him implicit denial. You don't give access to anything, no matter what. This is a good safety feature. That means now you can granularly provide access to first application, second application, third application. This is the secure way of working. But what happens if an organization is very big? Implicit denies are generally very, very badly efficient. Why? Because the new joinee will keep trying to find where to ask the access from, right? Then you have something called access control matrix. Authorization are generally, in an organization, erstwhile used to be done with access control matrix. If you look at AD, Active Directory, it is nothing but an access control matrix, okay? It's basically, you have access to what all, okay? And that's a simple access control matrix, okay? You also have capability tables that allow you to tell what you can do on a particular subject, okay? Generally, we have seen constraint interface. What is a constraint interface? A constraint interface is something which is always constrained. That means there is always a constraint on it. Okay. Now that comes from security architecture and engineering mechanism, wherein a constraint interface is always very, very limited access is given. So generally, things which are of very higher priority have very, very constrained interface. You cannot access them easily. Okay. Authorization can be content dependent, can be context dependent. Content dependent means what is the content and who can access it. It depends on the content of the subject, right? So if something has something very secret, you may not have access to it. And then you can have context dependent. Okay, I can access, if I am sitting in Europe, then only I can access the GDPR compliant data. If I'm sitting in India, I cannot, because it is context dependent. It is depending upon which state I am. And then authorization is also engineered with two very basic requirements, that is need to know and least principle. What is need to know? If you might have the clearance to access data, but that data does not form in your line of activities. So you're not given access to that, right? But you have the level of clearance to access that data. Means I have confidential, I have say secret clearance, okay? But that doesn't mean I need to know where are India's strategic assets lying. They also might be secret information, but I don't need to know because it doesn't concern my task. So that's why the need to know concept is applied on authorization principle. And then you have least privilege. These privileges, the minimum amount of privileges which you require to do your work. Okay. If I'm only supposed to given access to email, I'm only given access to email. I'm not given access to other documents because my work does not involve accessing other applications. So least privilege are defined as per the user rules. So you define a role, this particular role will have access to email systems and this particular application. Okay, then level 1 will have this, level 2 will have this, level 3 will have this. So that depends on the least privilege tells you what are the minimum amount of access levels to be given to a user, right? That's why you need to have a clear-cut access control policy. A good organization will always have a clear-cut access control policy, and access control policy generally have, physical access control policy and, application access control policy, or the IT access control policy. Generally, it might be a standalone policy, or it could be part of your overall information security policy. Now, this is where, we are done with the theory part. The more important part now is the access control models, which you should be very, very clear, because a lot of questions come from this access control models. Four very important part is the IEEE is something which you should, understand very clearly. Multi-factor authentication, you should understand very clearly. SSO, you should understand very clearly. Passkeys, you should understand very clearly. Okay, and access control models. Now, what are access control models and what are access control types? Now, access control models are broad models on which you can, design your access control systems. Okay. First is called a discretionary. Discretionary means that on the discretion of the asset owner. Okay. So say this is your asset and this is the subject. Subject wants to access. Now, the access is dependent on the discretion of the asset owner. Okay. He tells whether, access will be given or not, right? It is at the discretion of the asset owner. Then you have something called role-based. Okay, role-based is you have a subject, you have an object, and you have a subject. Subject roles define whether he will be allowed. Generally, roles carry out a tag or a group. Okay, if you are part of the admin group, then you are allowed to give access. If you are part of the user group, then you are not allowed to access, right? So role-based is generally grouping. Then you have rule-based. Rule-based are rules imposed on the subject. Okay. So you have this data and there is a rule. Rule says if the subject has IP address this, then allow. Where is it used? Firewalls. So firewalls are generally rule-based access, right? They are rule-based systems. Then you have something called attribute-based. Attribute-based systems, I give you an example of if I'm in India, then I get contact only Indian Netflix content. I don't get to see the, some hot content from US. Okay. Then I go what? I bypass. How do I bypass? I go through VPN. If you are sitting in US, you get only access to US content, right? So that is context dependent. You are in India or US. Okay. That is called, attribute-based access control model. Then you have something called mandatory model. Mandatory model is compartmentalized. Okay. The subject and the object are in the same compartment. Okay. If you remember Bell-LaPadula model, Biba model, these are all mandatory modules. Okay. Wherein if I have to access object, I need to carry a tag of this particular. Otherwise, I will not be allowed. I might have the clearance, but I'll still not be allowed because I'm not at that compartment only. This is a mandatory access control. Okay. And finally is risk-based. Now, this is the more recent methodology. Risk-based access control systems, what they do are employed generally in banks. Okay. Now, what happens is, say this is your transaction account, right? What happens is this user generally logs in from a particular device, particular location, particular time. Okay. Based on this particular context, the risk-based access control forms a baseline of risk. Okay. So say generally I access my online banking account from my home, from a particular GPS location. Okay. Then I generally access it from my iPhone. My iPhone's MAC address is something. Okay. Then I also access it at a particular time. Okay. And I generally, do it from my mobile app. This is the context, right? Now, this is the context which it creates here. Now, what happens that somebody has been able to spoof me, right? Or carry out a phishing attack. Now, many factors out of this will not match. And once the user tries to access this, you don't meet this baseline. And though you have the identity data, the authentication data, and the multi-factor authentication also, you will not get, because the risk-based access control system denies it. And I have seen this happening, a very beautiful control implemented by SBI. SBI has a group called SBI Risk Management Group, very beautifully designed by Infosys. It's a good, beautiful system. So what happens is, say your username password gets, phished, and then they call, the hackers call, basically the spammers call, and then they say, "Oh, ma'am, wo aapka OTP, you must have gotten OTP." They seek the OTP from you and push it. Now everything has gone as per the authentication cycle, but still access was not given. And this happened with my wife. And then I deep dived. And once I deep dived, then I had some friends in SBI who told me that this is how the risk management controls are working, right? Very beautiful concept. And those who are in banking, they might implement. But of course, it require a lot of context to be created.
It is collaborated with machine learning, maybe.
Okay. So discretion of the owner of the data, I told you already, right? Then you have something called non-discretionary. Non-discretion means the asset owner does not control. There is some centralized agency which controls the access to the object, right? If there is some centralized agency which controls the access, okay, such systems are called non-discretionary. There is no discretion of the asset owner. Somebody else is managing the access control. Though you might be the owner, I am the owner, but I don't have any control. Control is with some centralized agency who is granting access. Such systems are called non-discretionary. Discretionary systems are very clear. The discretion is of the asset owner. Okay. Then role-based access control, already told you, if you are part of a particular group, then you get the access. Generally, role-based access controls, they try to prevent privilege creep. Now, suppose you are part of the admin group, you always have rights of the admin group. So once you are from admin, you go to user, then you do not carry the rights of the user. Or if you are coming from user to admin, you carry out the rights. So what happens is, you do not have privilege creeps. You have very, very clear roles defined. Okay. So you go into either one role or the second role. You do not remain in different roles. Rule-based access control firewalls, I already told you. Attribute-based access control, I told you some characteristics, some metadata about you, which is used to grant you access. Mandatory access controls, I told you, you are part of a lattice or a compartment. Okay. Mandatory access controls are very, very prohibitive in nature. Okay. You generally have tags. Okay. Which, if you have the tag, then only you are allowed access to the object. Okay. Very, very prohibitive. Okay. Generally, MAC systems are used in places where you have very, very strict access control requirements, generally in government and very sensitive institutions. Now, mandatory access control can be of three types. One is called hierarchical environment, compartmentalized environment, hybrid environment. Now, what does this mean? Now, say this is top secret data, right? This is the people who can access top secret data, right? Then from here comes the people who can access secret data. Then there are few people who can access confidential data. Okay. So this is the compartmentalization. But as and when, the requirement comes, you are moved up. So this person might move up here in the hierarchy of the system, and then he has access to the secret data. From here, you get to the top hierarchy level. Then you have access to the top. Such systems are called hierarchical systems. Okay. Generally, in armed forces, we follow this hierarchical system. Why? Because when you were young, you have access to some limited information. Then you grow up, you become a colonel or a brigadier, you have access to secret data. Then you become a general, you have access to top secret data. This is called hybrid or a hierarchical arrangement. Then you have compartmentalized environment. Compartmentalized environment, okay, generally followed in scientists. You are a scientist of rocket. You have access to only rocket science data. You don't have access to inertial navigation data or something else, right? So what I'm trying to say, this is compartmentalized. You only are worried about your compartment, nothing else. Scientists from beginning to end work on one project 30 years, 40 years, and remain in that particular domain. And you can have hybrid. Everything can be hybrid. So suppose you want to have compartmentalization along with a hierarchical nature. So you mix both of them and you can have a mix and match, okay, of both of them. You want to use the properties of both of the systems. Risk-based access control, I told you, relatively new concept, important, might come in exam because it's introduced newly. Okay. Then how do you implement authentication systems, right? So now I will tell you about the systems which can be used for implementing SSO. Now, this is very important. This is favorite questions of you should understand very clearly all these concepts. Okay. Now, what is XML? No, XML is a data exchange language. Okay. Now, suppose I want to exchange some data with you, right? Very simply on a web page. I want to share some data. XML gives you the provision of interpreting data in a very, very simple manner using quotes, okay, and with data. Very human readable format. Very easy for you to exchange information. Okay. So XML was a language used for data interchange. From place A to place B, you want to transfer data from one database to another. How do you transfer it? Use XML. Straight away it will go. Right? SAML is a derivative of the XML. Now, SAML, what happens? The SSO process is very simple. Okay, I'll briefly draw the SSO process. So this is the subject. Okay, subject needs access to multiple applications, and these are the applications, right? Application 1, application 2, application 3, right? And there is a service provider. This is the identity service provider. So identity service provider enrolls you and gives you an identity. This identity might be an email, xyz@abc.com. Right? Now this becomes your identity associated with you. Now this identity wants to access the application. So there you need an authentication service. So then next comes the authentication service. So you need an authentication service also. So okay, fine. With this identity, you create an authentication data. So you create a password, okay, and you create an MFA, right? This becomes the identity and identity provider. This becomes the IDP. Now what happens is, first time you have authenticated to this identity provider. Now you want to access the application. Once you go to the application and say, I want to access you, this is the first, request. The application now tells you, okay, you want to authenticate using the identity provider, that is Google. So now I will tell Google, hey, Google, this guy has come to me whose name is xyz@abc.com. Do you know him? So Google will take this identity and compare this authentication and say, yeah, he is with me. And he will say, yes, he is with me, and I'm giving you his username and password in an encrypted manner. He takes this username and password and grants access. Similarly with app 2 and app 3. Now this communication which is happening, this is where different kind of languages come in. Now, SAML is this language which helps you in exchanging this data between the subject, the identity provider, and the application service. Okay, I hope I am clear. Okay, SAML will help you in interchanging this identity and authentication data. If this you have understood this much, everything else is same. Okay. Now, how you implement SAML? You are the subject. This is the SAML identity provider. You authenticate to the SAML identity provider, and service provider is nothing but the application. Okay. Application, he says, hey, I want to give access to the user. And then the SAML identity provider says, yeah, I trust him. You can give him access. Okay. And then access is granted. This is the simple way of SAML. This interchange of data happens with a SAML protocol, which is a secure way of handling data. Okay. So SAML has, three key requirements. One is the user, right? Second is the service provider. Service provider is the service which you want to use. Say you want to go to Facebook. Say this is Facebook. Okay, and you want to log into Facebook. And you created, and your identity is with a SAML identity provider. So you first ask for request. The service provider authenticates with the SAML identity provider. Okay, SAML identity provider, tells user, hey, why don't you enter your username and password? You enter your username and password. It goes to the database and checks and says, hey, everything is fine. It gives the data to the service provider, hey, everything is fine, and it grants access. This is what happens on a mobile phone if you are trying to access. SAML is one way of implementing single sign-on. Okay, please understand this. Second is OAuth. Now, OAuth is not a language. OAuth is a framework for implementing SSO. Okay, so OAuth is a framework for implementing SSO. Right now, OAuth 2.0 is in practice. OAuth 1.0 has been debunked. Systems which were using OAuth 1.0 have migrated to OAuth 2.0 because OAuth 2.0 was not backward compatible with OAuth 1.0. Okay, this is one of the major, SSO framework on the cloud. Then you say, okay, I don't want to rely on Google. I don't want to rely on Facebook. I don't want to rely on LinkedIn to provide me identity. I want to create my own identity system. If you want to create your own identity system, then you can use something called OpenID. Now, a lot of applications you will see support SSO with Google, SSO with Microsoft, and then you will see written OpenID also. They also support OpenID. That means if you have created your own OpenID server and using this protocol, and then you use OpenID to log into multiple applications. Knowing this much is more than enough. All this is not required. So you don't want to use Google's identity service or Microsoft's identity service. You want to create your own identity service. OpenID is an open source identification service which you can use, implement, and then using that OpenID data, you can log into multiple applications who support OpenID. You have to support, those systems have to support OpenID. And that's where OIDC Connect is a layer which supports the OpenID. OIDC is OpenID Connect, which gives you the connection between the service provider. So OIDC, you say you have created a OpenID. Okay, you create an OpenID, and this is your application where you want to open. OIDC is OpenID Connect service, which connects your OpenID to your application. Okay, knowing this much is more than enough for OpenID.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe our channel.